Welcome to a thought-provoking journey through the world of global finance, diplomacy, and economic dynamics. We'll explore key insights from a recent discussion on these topics. So, grab your popcorn and let's dive in.
This de-dollarization that people are talking about really starting back in around 2000 and gaining particular momentum after the global financial crisis in 2009. And now here we are again, and things are really heating up again. So maybe in sort of very cursory fashion, you can kind of explain to people how much work has gone in to this process of creating a viable alternative to the US dollar over the last 20 years, and what this upcoming BRICS meeting in August means in that context.
Acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. Jim O'Neill and some partners came up with it. And all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders, and said, well, who's left that will be the up-and-comers, the fastest growing developing economies? And they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favorite of South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you probably, you can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. So that's how it evolved. So for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meeting, and it's famous, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes there are 3 or 4, say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk.
BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It was coined by Goldman Sachs in 2002 to identify the fastest growing developing economies. While South Africa is smaller in size, it was included as an African representative.
Well, when you have a multilateral, multi-country currency union, that problem goes away.
Yeah.
Because now Russia sells oil to China, China pays in BRICS, the BRIC currency, pays you in BRIC. But Russia can take the BRIC and turn around to Argentina and say, we'd like to buy, or Brazil maybe, and we'd like to buy some Embraer aircraft. And Brazil gets the BRIC currency, and they can turn around to China and say, we'd like to buy some rice. And then China takes, et cetera. And so you've solved the quasi-barter problem. Mm-hmm. You've solved the problem of what to do with a pile of currency that you really can't use other than certain goods and services, but not everything you want. You can't have a currency union without a common fiscal policy. And I said, I don't want to mention his name, but I said, have you not heard of the euro? I mean, there is no common fiscal policy in Europe. Don't tell me that Italy has the same fiscal policy as the Netherlands, or that Germany has the same fiscal policy as Greece. They don't. They do have a central bank that issues the currency, has a little bit of gold, but not a lot relative to the size of the economy. But there's no common fiscal policy, and there's no common bond market. To this day, there's no such thing as a bond, I'll call it a euro bond, backed by the full faith and credit of the entire European monetary zone. It doesn't exist. You can buy German bonds in euros, you can buy Italian bonds in euros, but you can't buy a euro bond backed by all those countries.
Common fiscal policy. The importance of a common fiscal policy in a currency union is highlighted. However, it's noted that the Eurozone lacks a common fiscal policy despite sharing a currency.
At the GDP ratios, kind of stuff you look at all the time, debt to GDP ratios, annual deficits, dare I say, modern monetary theory, our friend Stephanie Kelton. I mean, all these ideas are ruining the dollar, and everyone can see it. but not yet. And so if you want to launch this new currency and you say, hey, long term, the dollar is going to collapse in terms of gold. I'll hook my horse to this wagon called gold by weight, and I'll just reap the benefits, and I don't have to do a thing.
Multilateral currency union. A multilateral, multi-country currency union is suggested as a solution to overcome limitations when two countries trade and accept each other's currency. This could help diversify trade possibilities.
The downside that one would normally envision, which is if you foresee the dollar collapsing relative to gold and the currency therefore appreciating, there's a threshold of pain normally where they say, "But we don't want it that strong." But if they're trading within their own block, it sort of negates that entire problem, doesn't it?
Exactly.
And the other thing that they've been doing with those dollars that they needed to recycle, even before we imposed sanctions on Russia, was obviously they were diversifying out of treasuries into hard assets. I mean, you've seen a shift from accumulating treasuries to accumulating gold, and obviously China building strategic oil reserves, etc., and moving to cobble together, as you mentioned, all these trade agreements outside of dollars. But they've been actively diversifying away from treasuries even before, they began to wonder if they wouldn't have access to that money in the first place.
Right.
But the gold thing, I think, is interesting because they have been accumulating gold in pretty aggressive fashion. I think it's interesting that you draw this distinction between currency that references gold and a currency that's redeemable in gold, because a lot of the headlines that you read suggest this is a gold-backed currency, which I guess is, clearly something you would disagree with. And do you believe that when they make this announcement on August 22nd or 23rd, they'll make clear that this is a reference and they'll come out with the actual weight, the gold weight, and lay it all out?
Well, I'm sorry. Sergei Lavrov said it is. Now, Sergei Lavrov is the greatest, smartest, most powerful diplomat in the world. He's the foreign minister of Russia. I wish I could say something similar about the U.S. team, but I can't. We got Jake Sullivan's a political hack. Tony Blinken's a lightweight. Victoria Nuland's a bloodthirsty warmonger. I mean, we just have, she's got like an undergraduate degree. I mean, okay school, but what kind of training is that for running the world?
They're also just blinded by hubris. I mean, no one imagines that the BRICS could ever pose any material threat to U.S. hegemony in any fashion.
Dollar's reserve currency status. There are concerns about the dollar's global reserve currency status. Various nations, including China, are making efforts to reduce their dependence on the dollar in international trade.
E.F. Hutton, Dean Witter, Merrill Lynch. When were these firms founded? It was around 1910, 1912, 1914, and a little bit later in some cases. But the Liberty Bond was the beginning of the retail investing market in the United States. Prior to World War I, U.S. wars were always financed by big shots. Stephen Girard financed the War of 1812. Nicholas Biddle financed the Revolutionary War. James Cook financed the Civil War. They had these dealers who did it, but that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example, contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market, where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds, and if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market because somebody will start making a market in it.
Retail investing market. The script discusses the historical development of the retail investing market in the United States, beginning with the Liberty Bond during World War I.
In Johannesburg, its locations flipped around, but they've ended up in Johannesburg, technically a place called Sandton, which is Johannesburg is so crime-ridden, they built another city right next to it that's pretty clean, so they call it Sandton. That's where the conference is going to be. This is the Leaders Summit. I mentioned they have 100 or more mini summits all over the world. This is the Leaders Summit. So Ramaphosa of South Africa, Lula da Silva, Brazil, Prime Minister Modi of India, and Xi Jinping of China are going to be there. Now, Putin was supposed to be there, but here it gets complicated. There's an outstanding warrant for Putin's arrest issued by the International Criminal Court on, so-called war crimes.
BRICS Leaders Summit. A BRICS Leaders Summit is mentioned, with leaders from South Africa, Brazil, India, and China attending. Putin's attendance is uncertain due to an outstanding warrant for his arrest.
Question of the dollar's standing and the willingness of the rest of the world to indulge the exorbitant privilege, or whatever phrase you want to use. And to me, the ultimate conclusion that I come to, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that we have an issue that's untenable. We can't finance our deficits at this point. There's just no way. And if the Fed has to pick up all of the slack, its balance sheet is just going to explode to the point that it's just untenable for the dollar.
The first one is the Fed the ultimate buyer of last resort of Treasuries? Yes. But there's an intermediate buyer, which is the U.S. banking system. In the 1950s, a typical large U.S. bank balance sheet was 40% Treasuries. That was normal. That wasn't like hoarding. Today, it's about 5 to 7%. So I think you'll get a phone call to Jamie Dimon and all the other CEOs, Jane Meyer and the lady at Citi. They'll call them first to say, people got to buy bonds. And of course, they're all under the thumb of the U.S. government, and they will. So you might have a pretty good cushion of bond buyers before you have to turn to the Fed and expand the Fed balance sheet. Now, that doesn't
especially if it's a recession, because they're not going to want to make loans with that money. They'd rather buy treasuries that are perceived to be safe, probably.
Correct, especially with positive carry and lever at 10 to 1 under Basel, you can make very good returns on equity.
U.S. banking system and treasuries. The U.S. banking system is highlighted as an intermediate buyer of U.S. treasuries, with a typical large U.S. bank holding around 5 to 7% of its balance sheet in treasuries.
So you do have a large pool of intermediate buyers before you get to the Fed. It doesn't really solve the problem. It just passes it around the banking system. By the way, the Chinese are doing something very similar right now. Everyone's like, why hasn't the People's Bank of China sold more dollars? Well, it's because they're making the banks do it. The commercial banks are selling the dollars and propping up the yuan. And we could see something similar in the United States. So that's one. I just kind of pencil in the commercial banking system, at least the big banks, as potential buyers of not quite last resort, as a way to put it. But the other thing, the BRICS, what they've done, this is part of the brilliance, they've opted out of the exchange market. They're like, because normally if the dollar is getting weaker, you're getting stronger. That's bad for exports. It's bad for export-related jobs, et cetera. And it's currency wars. That was my first book, Currency Wars. But by defining their currency by weight of gold, not dollar amount, but by weight of gold, they're out of the foreign exchange market.
Yeah,
so, and they can just sit back and watch the show.
Critique of diplomacy criticizes certain diplomatic approaches as resembling schoolyard bullying rather than constructive diplomacy.
Victoria Nuland has now replaced Wendy Sherman as Deputy Secretary of State, second only to the Secretary of State. But she wanted this war, and she got it. There's an old proverb, be careful what you wish for, you may get it. And that's exactly what happened. By the way, quick footnote, Victoria Nuland is going to South Africa the week before the BRICS Summit.
Interesting.
Now, she's going to try to bully South Africa into like not doing the deal or joining Russian sanctions or anti-Russian sanctions.
Media and diplomacy mentions skepticism about media outlets like the Washington Post and emphasizes the importance of understanding the motives behind their reporting. Victoria Nuland's role in the U.S. government and her involvement in foreign policy are also discussed.
Well, this whole Russian thing has been, it looked like we really provoked it to some extent.
Yes.
At least had a role in, pushing Putin in there. Presumably with the idea that it would inure to the U.S.'s benefit somehow. And it ends up not only being a disaster from a military standpoint, but because of the sanctions, now from a financial standpoint as well. So, I mean, if you were to invent the worst possible policy, you probably would have done everything that...
South Africa and BRICS. There's an upcoming BRICS Summit in South Africa, and Victoria Nuland's visit to South Africa is seen as an attempt to influence South Africa's decisions regarding BRICS and Russian sanctions. And there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the world of finance, diplomacy, and global dynamics. We hope you enjoyed this engaging and insightful journey. Remember to stay curious and keep exploring the ever-changing world around us. Until next time, this is Jim Rickards signing off.